They don't understand it. And I also think that they don't have the influence, right? I have the responsibility, but I don't have the authority, right?
That's a perfect example of that. We see that all the time. And we talked about that a couple of weeks ago, where CISO now has responsibility for an enterprise-wide security program, including the OT space, but they don't have the authority because they're always stopped at the plant floor because they don't understand, or production gets in the way, or, for whatever reason, they can't execute on their task.
Welcome to the Industrial Cybersecurity Insider. In each episode, we dive into the world of industrial cybersecurity. Join us as we cover the latest trends, innovations, and practical insights as we talk with leaders and practitioners across the industry. Gear up and let's get into this week's episode.
Hi, I'm Dino Busalaki.
And I'm Craig Duckworth. So what do you want to talk about today, Dino?
I think we want to chat about what are the types of cyber events that can cripple the plant floor. And the pathway in is typically through IT systems.
I like that idea.
You had one that recently came up. Maybe you want to share what that one was.
Yeah, so Unify was just in the news recently. It was very clear that they had an IT-related issue. But again, they were unable. So Unify is a large wholesale grocery distributor. They were unable to fill orders for their customers based on their lack of stalled forklifts at their hobbled distribution centers as they reported it. So again, their OT assets, their forklifts, their automated control or automated guided vehicles that were processing food orders were being impacted, and they were not able to ship grocery items to some of their largest or many of their clients, Whole Foods being one of their largest. So they, in essence, had a contract with Whole Foods and Amazon to provide that. I don't know the details. Something tells me there's a pretty tight SLA on having food on the shelves.
Yep. And this is not unique to them, right? We've seen this with Clorox. We've seen this with, a very large global bakery that we know of. There's a laundry list of them that have been impacted by events that come through the IT environment. And there's many, many avenues that can happen that drift down onto that plant floor and become impactful. The plant floor is using a lot of the same technologies that IT is using. And those environments are usually overlooked from a cybersecurity perspective. They're not patched as often as the IT space is. And it's very costly when those control systems aren't producing goods or moving goods or whatever they're tasked to do, and their plant becomes idle.
Yeah, but again, it kind of goes back to what is the organizational's architecture for their industrial control space? Is it one large flat network that's combined with their IT so that it makes it easier for an adversary to pivot, get to the OT space? Or, is there microsegmentation? Are there true traditional firewalls with a DMZ in the middle to try and provide that protection? Think defense in depth architecture and layering. And how do you secure and protect those industrial assets, even if they are on one large network in the beginning, until you can take steps to further protect yourselves?
Yeah. Well, we're working with another very large food distribution company and going through a project where they've implemented an OT IDS platform, but they haven't really gone out and done the due diligence to determine the breadth and depth of the visibility within their environment. Basically, what they did is they sent out collectors to their remote locations. Sometimes they get installed, sometimes they don't. Where they get installed is usually too high up within the enterprise network at the site, meaning at the plant level, and it's not really picking up the control system. We always talk about north, south, and east, west. They're not even picking up a lot of the southbound traffic, let alone the east-west traffic. But what I recognize is the IT leadership that's driving the project really lack a fundamental relationship with these business units, with these manufacturers, to be able to influence, to work with each other in a manner to really improve that cybersecurity posture. And we see this a lot where, to think globally, act locally, we say that a lot. And whether it's the networking team, the InfoSec team, the IT leadership, is they don't necessarily have the influence with the local site to get an understanding of that environment well enough to determine how do you architect and strategically implement these technologies, right? And that's a gap. It's a big gap that we see a lot. It's almost like they're adverse to even trying to work with that portion of the business, I think because it's too difficult for them.
They don't necessarily understand it fully, I don't believe.
Well, they don't understand it. And I also think that they don't have the influence, right? I have the responsibility, but I don't have the authority, right?
That's a perfect example of that. We see that all the time. And we talked about that a couple of weeks ago, where CISO now has responsibility for an enterprise-wide security program, including the OT space, but they don't have the authority because they're always stopped at the plant floor because they don't understand, or production gets in the way, or, for whatever reason, they can't execute on their task.
Right. And I think they lack that inherent knowledge of that facility, meaning that sometimes the IT teams, and when they go to the field with us, it's the first time they've ever been to this plant. Or their visits to the plant have been very superficial, meaning that they're just there to put in some networking equipment or work on some project, but it's not really getting out on the plant floor and looking at that infrastructure and those control system architectures, and really understanding how those things are put together and where they're connected and what are they connecting to within the plant, and to be able to really get a full understanding of it, right? And you just can't do that and be successful, right? You just can't have that superficial knowledge of your manufacturing environment.
Let's kind of walk through, if we can, some IT OT convergent fundamentals, if we call it. The difference between IT and OT, the plant floor and critical infrastructure, the most common techniques and pathways that potential adversaries can get in. So if we look at from an IT and an OT side, the IT network is fairly well defined.
Yes and no, especially at the plant level, right? Even on what the IT truly owned asset responsibilities, not necessarily all that well documented. We see that a lot. I mean, because we always request documentation in order to get, site drawings, network drawings, trying to get as much information as we can. And a lot of that stuff is missing, right? And it doesn't exist, or it hasn't been touched in years and they haven't updated it. And so that creates all these gaps, right? Because you just don't know what's been implemented from somebody, who shows up at the plant with their computer, a tech maintenance person is going to work on machine X, and they just wander into the plant and nobody's, reviewed their machine or what they're necessarily doing or what they're touching, when they're in there. So that's one path. And whether you go in and plug right into the PLC, or whether they go plug into a switch down on the control system side, or whether they remote in, right? Then you have OEMs that will put in their own VPN concentrator or their own Cradle Point cellular modem. And then you'll find 4 to 7 different remote access technologies in a single plant, because there's several different OEMs and system integrators working in your manufacturing facility. There's not one. There's a bunch, which get back to the podcast that we just did in the past week or so, is that I believe the CIOs and the CISOs need to start making some new friends. And what I mean by that is you need to start looking at building a relationship with who the primary system integrators and OEMs are that are designing and implementing and supporting machine centers in your manufacturing facilities.
Yeah, and I believe that today, more than ever, with the geopolitical landscape, the continuous increase of ransomware and or activist activities that are affecting organizations, whether they're doing it for chaos or they're doing it for money or they're just doing it because they just don't care and they have nothing better to do. It's more urgent. It's more pressing for organizations to take stances now to begin securing and protecting and understanding what they need to do to implement security protocols on their OT side to protect themselves. These acts that we see like Unify and Oldsmar a couple of years ago and Colonial Pipeline a couple of years ago and, the Toyota manufacturing supply chain, all of those are going to continue and they're going to be becoming more and more frequent. I'm afraid that we are almost becoming numb to the media about it's another one, it's another one, it's another one. But Unify, for example, their valuation dropped $500 million in 60 hours. Let that set in for a second. 60 hours, $500 million in lost valuation. That wasn't production. That was market cap, market valuation. Will that come back? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. But just like with Clorox, if the retailers can't sell product, they'll find another distributor or another like product to sell from a competitor to fill that space. And that's what will hurt in the long run.
Well, the absurdity of it all is it's preventable. The question is what is it that you can do better? Why aren't you driving towards that end, to get to what I call the know and what I got to do to secure and protect this. And again, it can't be driven 100% by IT and be successful from the plant floor. And if you think that you can pull that off, you're fooling yourself. If you think that just you can purely run this from an IT position and be successful in securing and protecting those industrial control system assets.
Well, I talked with a client 2 days ago, and they had experienced an incident 2 years ago. And I asked, the question, what's their posture? What are they doing? And the response was, we're better this year than we were last year. Okay, they're making progression. But I'm like, so you still don't have any of these things in place, but you are getting better. So I commend them for that. But I think that the speed at which they are making progress is less than stellar.
Well, and those are the organizations that are trying to do this internally.
That's correct. There was one person responsible to try and do this. That is a true statement.
We witnessed that, right? I mean, especially if you've got dozens or hundreds of sites, they're just putting enough resources behind it to accomplish it. And you don't have the resources internally to pull this off. You just don't. One, you don't have the expertise. Two, you don't have the knowledge and the capabilities with these technologies and how they fit. Even implementing a security framework, have you even started that? And if you have, where are you in that journey in that particular case, especially around your industrial assets? You might say you're doing a really good job on the IT side. That's great. Well, let's take a look at the plant floor and see if you're doing the same thing. And that's where we're going to find the gaps, right? Getting back to not being able to do this by yourself as an IT organization, you're going to have to start crossing into that IT, OT space. You're going to have to start spending some time in those manufacturing environments, and you're going to have to rely on the integrators and the OEMs and the local teams to pull this off.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about prevention and risk mitigation. How should an organization, or really kind of what defensive strategies are effective today? I mentioned earlier the DMZ. You got a firewall on the north side, firewall on the south side. There's argument of we only need one firewall. Where should it be? What does that look like? How should they kind of approach that piece of it to try and start doing something? What does that look like?
Before you can start building those types of defensible architectures, you have to have a baseline. Right, which means you have to have an asset inventory that's fairly accurate and up to date. And you got to be, ideally, you want to be continuously monitoring that. And then once you have that, you should be able to map out there the communication flows between those industrial assets and the external devices that they're communicating with, whether it's within the line or the zone in the area and the plant, and what is unwarranted. So what is warranted traffic versus unwarranted traffic, right? So you can determine how you can start implementing, intrusion prevention types of systems and or changing VLAN strategies and or providing limited access into certain control system environments, right? As you start building out that defensible architecture. So asset inventory, then understand the risk and vulnerabilities, get into those communication flows to determine what is warranted traffic versus unwarranted traffic into these areas. And that includes secure remote access that's being allowed into that environment, right? And then you can start building that defensible architecture that you're talking about, and start moving in a general direction. Because we have found that those organizations that have gone down that path, even though other areas in their company have been hit, those plants have been unaffected, right? And it's not because there's a firewall in the mix. It's because there's actually been a defensible architecture strategy implemented around those control systems.
Well, if we were to go back, you and I both know Unify had multiple, probably many firewalls in place. That was not the concern. Clorox had many firewalls in place. That was not the issue. So we had a firewall is not going to fix things. But once they put it in and they start trying to figure it out, let's say that something does go sideways and there is an incident or a breach or whatever legal terminology the organization wants to use. How does the incident recovery and the response differ from an IT and an OT? On our side of the OT, we are always saying safety first, safety first, safety first. And we say, how do we safely bring the OT assets back up, bring them operational? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, the first responder is not an IT person in a breach in a manufacturing environment. It's the operator, right? Somebody's got to be able to get that machine and those systems into a safe place and potentially get product into a safe place. All right, back to your point, safety is an issue, not trying to destroy, maybe millions of dollars in product. That's your first response. If you have an incident response plan, your operator is the first one on the scene in an OT environment when you have a breach of that nature, right? And the question is, do you even practice that and plan for that kind of stuff, right? If you have an event. And then if you do have the event, do you have visibility into the control systems to see if they're being impacted or not by the same virus that's ransacking other portions of the enterprise network, right? You want to make sure that it's not drifted into the plant realm. Because if it hasn't, then you can probably continue to operate instead of, whether you disconnect from the enterprise network, to keep whatever's going on the enterprise side from making its way into the plant, if you can operate that way. Most plants try to run in a decentralized fashion, meaning they don't rely on anything outside the plant from a technology perspective to operate. Sometimes we see warehouses that are centralized, and if you lose the centralized warehouse system, then the warehouse can become blind and unoperable, but the rest of the plant can still run.
Yeah, I get that aspect of it. It's important. But from a risk standpoint, from a risk assessment in converged IT, OT environments that are there, the risk, and I think a business needs to understand and really convert risk to dollars and cents. If they look at it from a widget standpoint, it sometimes gets lost. We make 5,000 widgets a day or whatever that number is, or 2,000 a minute or whatever. So that number it's non-monetized. But if every widget is $1.25 and you're making 1,000 of them, you got $125,000 in a whack, whether that's in an hour or in a minute or in a day or whatever it is. An organization understands dollars and cents. And that's something that the risk manager, the CFO can equate to and see what does that downtime cost them or what would their potential loss be? And then begin looking at it from a remediation standpoint, from a cost dollar valuation of does it make sense to do this for the return?
Yeah. Well, in my view, when it comes to those types of OEE, operational effectiveness, where you're able to determine your efficiencies, which determines your profitability or your revenue generating. I would argue that IT is not really close to that because we provide those types of systems, right? We provide MES systems and line efficiencies and OEE types of activities on the control system side, but we're never working really with IT on that. It's usually all around the plant operation and engineering teams that we're generally working with on that particular front. I don't think that IT views that a plant downtime window, regardless of the event, is their problem.
I would say you're 100% correct. They are not concerned with because the priorities are different. On the operational side, we know priorities is uptime first. And on the IT side, it's data security. And they are not the same.
Yeah. I mean, again, IT may have some oversight role on what's going on, but the people that have to determine what it's going to take to get those systems either safely shut down or bring them back up online is purely done by that OT organization. All IT can really do is make sure that the network is still there. But if they're not down there reviewing the OEM's machine center to see if there's malware in it, right? If they even have access to it, would they even be granted access to it? Again, it gets back to my earlier statement of needing new friends, where you're going to have to build a relationship with these suppliers who are providing these technologies and solutions for you so that you can start driving a cybersecurity narrative with those guys and what it is that you expect and what you would like to see out of them to say that they're doing this in a cyber safe way. We're starting to see some of that language in the RFIs and RFQs that we're getting where they're asking about cybersecurity practice capabilities of the engineering organization, right? And who's reviewing that remains to be seen, because a lot of these organizations, we turn around and go, okay, do you have a cybersecurity tool platform in place that we should be leveraging as part of the telemetry around the project that we're working on, right? Which we should be after also, right? From that perspective, what is the telemetry around these machine centers to determine how I can execute my job, make sure that there's no malware down there, make sure that there's no unwarranted traffic in here or remote access in here. If I got into life into support assets that are involved, so I can understand the risks associated with them. So there's a whole approach to doing it, right? You have to have, whether you're following the 5 SANS OT critical controls or the NIST or IEC 62443, others that are out there, the organizations are, what framework are you following, if at all, right? Those are the conversations that need to be had going back and forth between the client and the integrators and the OEMs, IT, OT on the client side, getting all the liars in the same room, as I call it.
Well, another piece of this that is often overlooked that needs to be absolutely incorporated are the IoT devices. When I'm out on a plant floor and I walk around and I see 100 cameras, whether they're monitoring a production line or they're scanning something, or the printers that are printing nonstop for whatever the process is, a lot of these IoT devices that are in the OT space helping production and facilitate and do these things are often overlooked. That firmware is not normally updated. They're normally put in with default passwords because they don't think of them as an operating system, something that could be an issue. But the manufacturing floors are riddled and laced with IoT assets. And I hope that organizations are including those as they're trying to figure this process out.
Yeah. Well, and as you're describing that, the question is, from an IT perspective, is that your responsibility? And I would probably argue that it's not, right? Like a PLC firmware upgrade, or drive upgrade, or HMI or DCS, when it comes to those magnitude of control systems that are out there, AGVs, IT's not driving that remediation and mitigation, because they don't know what it takes to do that firmware upgrade. What other things have to go along with that? How do you test it? How do you back out? Does it break any of the applications surrounding that firmware as far as the systems that it's communicating with? You have to be able to somehow gauge that. And if it's an OEM piece of equipment, then you got to go to the OEM and have that conversation, right? And depending on your contractual relationship with them, they may be able to assist, or they may tell you, no, don't touch that machine. So then the question is, well, how do you surround that machine and isolate it, even though you still need connectivity in and out of it? Well, then how do you manage that, right? How do you put a microscope on those conversations coming in and out of that machine, whether it's the OEM remoting in or that machine talking to another machine that's part of the process to be able to make sure that nothing changes. I got my baseline and now I'm just looking for anomalies. I'm looking for malware. Are you getting to that level? And if you are, who's doing that? And I would argue that that's not an IT team doing it at that level.
Right. No, it definitely is not.
And so the OT teams have to really step up their game. And so now you have to ask yourself the question, well, if that's the case, then IT, I'm out. I don't have a role.
Right. They need to have some role. And because, again, in every single client that we've gone in that's been hugely successful, we've seen it on both sides. We've been successful on the IT side. We've been successful on the OT side exclusively. But where organizations collaborate, work together, and to tackle this from a combined effort of IT and OT, and they share skill sets and they share frameworks and they share information. That is the everybody wins scenario. And that's what we like to see the best. As we come to the end, let's look at this. What's one or two pieces of advice that we would give or you would have for organizations that really don't know where to start or trying to figure it out? We talked a lot about what happens, but you got to do something. You got to, every period, quarter, year, month, you got to be getting better. You have to progress toward a better hygiene. Where do you start? Can't eat the elephant all in one bite.
Well, you got to go interview who it is you want to work with, for starters, right? I mean, some of them may already be in your house. You just don't know it. And I'm not talking about on the IT side as much as I'm talking on the OT side. Obviously, there's vendors out there who will sell you hardware and software all day long. And it's up to you to figure it out, right? And then, as far as a good practice is to go find organizations that actually take that stuff and implement it and have done it, in hundreds of plants across dozens of verticals that actually has the experience and the references to demonstrate their capabilities around this versus somebody who either just dabbles in it or who's just selling it. And the question is, as the client, as the manufacturer, are you going to build a practice? Are you going to do that? Or is your intent to just pick a tool and just kind of muddle around with it yourself, which we've seen that too, and then ends up becoming shelfware slowly because, again, you get that gap between IT and OT. They can't get far enough down into the space. They're not sending their people to the field to really do this discovery work, to really get after getting a clean, clear asset inventory, right? We see that so often. So you have to find organizations that do this on a regular basis, all day, every day.
And they can leverage organizations like ours or someone within their environment today to give them that guidance, support, to work alongside them until they have the skill sets, until they are capable on their own. Or if some organizations may say, you know what, I want to take the IT approach and be 100% hands off, and I want to outsource all of this to another organization that has the subject matter experts to guide us and lean on for that piece of it. And that's okay too, but don't take the road by yourself. There are all kinds of support systems, all kinds of resources available. Reach out, talk to somebody, call us, call somebody different, if that makes sense. But don't try and tackle it on your own. There's all kinds of options.
Right. Even the vendors that you're talking to from the technology perspective, you got to look at the partners that they have, right? The relationships they have. And it's not just so much, talking about cybersecurity and say, oh, these guys are an Armis or Clarity or Nozomi partner. But also they have to be Rockwell and Siemens and Involutions and Emerson, working with these automation technologies. So if you're looking at buying a cybersecurity technology and or services from somebody, the next thing you need to look at is like, well, who are your partners? Are you a Rockwell partner? And if the answer is no, then why would I have you help me do this? There's a whole another organization that needs to be involved in this. And if they're not working, like I said, with a Rockwell or a Siemens or an Emerson or a GE or a Honeywell or a Schneider, they don't do anything with those guys, then how are they going to help you?
Totally agreed. Well, I think that's all the time we got, Dino. Great conversation. For those of you that are listening, make sure you're reaching out to your partner community, you're understanding the ecosystem that you're playing in, and leverage the resources available to you. Call us, reach out to somebody else, do something. You got to continue to improve and start working on securing your environments.
Otherwise, you lose millions.
Hundreds of millions, like 500. That's a big number. 500 million in 60 hours. Let it sink in. That's going to hurt a lot of people. So, have a great day.
Thanks for tuning in to the Industrial Cybersecurity Insider. To stay up to date with our latest episodes, be sure to click the follow or subscribe button now. And if you found this podcast helpful or have a topic you'd like us to discuss, please leave us a review or let us know. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.